Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Well, today we're going to build upon a topic that we first covered about 16 months ago. Today's topic is learning more about user access on the Horner OCS. So user access is an important feature. Again, we covered it pretty thoroughly about 16 months ago, but we're going to give you new information today that will help you use it even better. Now, this is the part of our program where I normally would bring in our product manager, Casey Gardner, but it's training week, and Casey normally has his segments from inside the training room, and since the training room is busy, no live Casey today. However, Casey is standing by to answer any questions you have. If you chat them live during the session today, he'll get those answered right away. If you're watching this on replay like a lot of you do, then we'll get those questions and comments responded to just as quickly as we can, usually within a day or two. Okay, let's take a look at how we're breaking down today's topic. Okay, we're going to start by doing a quick review of the user access feature. So that's the one that we first covered, again, about 16 months ago. And then we're going to talk about the differences between using hard-coded user credentials and variable-based user credentials, because in our first broadcast, we really only talked about using hard-coded user credentials. We're also going to talk about some of the WebMI limitations when it comes to the user access feature. And of course, we're going to show you how to overcome those limitations, and there will be demonstrations throughout. All right, here we go. Okay, now I do want to mention that the video that we had, again, about 16 months ago is a really good introduction to this feature while we'll be building upon the information we shared with you before, and we will be doing a quick review. I would definitely encourage you to go take a look at that when you get a chance. So let's start with our quick review. So what do we mean by user access or user security? Well, it's a feature that's supported in some OCS models, not all of them. We'll detail that in a minute, that allows you to restrict what an operator can see and operate on the touchscreen, or even what an operator can effectively see or operate remotely over WebMI. Now, the way that works is users are given credentials and they need to log in either directly to the touchscreen or remotely over WebMI. And then again, they're restricted in what they can see and what they can operate. Now, only certain models support the user access feature in the touchscreen itself, and that is limited to the X5, the XL series from the XL4 on up, the entire XL Prime series, and in the future, the entire Canvas series will also support this feature. Now, if you happen to be using an XLE or an XLT, or maybe even a micro OCS series product, it doesn't mean that you can't protect certain screens or certain objects. You can, it's just you'll need to kind of roll your own functionality in that regard. And it's definitely possible in the near future we could do a video on that topic showing you an approach you might take to solve that particular situation with one of those two products. Okay, so how does the user access feature actually work? Well, at Horner, what we decided to do many years ago when we implemented this feature was to implement it on an object level. So that means every object that has an action, every touch button that may be used to adjust a set point, every touch button that might be used to start or stop a motor or something, every touch button that could be used to change screens, each of those buttons could be set with an access level. Now, we chose that approach as opposed to just password protecting a screen because we thought it was the most efficient approach. Otherwise, what you could end up with is a bunch of screens that you would have to create that are similar but a little bit different, designed for different operators. By implementing user access at the object level, you could have the same screen that a bunch of operators could all look at, even if they had different credentials. However, they could only actually perform actions on certain objects on the screen. So that's the approach that we took. And once again, any object that can perform action would be anything that where you touch the screen, it actually causes an action, like changing a set point, like starting or stopping or turning a bit on and off, or changing screens, for instance. Now, the way you set that up in Cscape is during your screen configuration process. So anytime that you have an object on one of your screens that has an action to it, you'll find if you double click on that object and go into the configuration dialog, you'll find that it has a access button, whereas objects that don't have any kind of action when they're pressed don't have an access button. And then from that access button, you can go in and set the access level of that particular object at up to 8 different levels. An access level of 0 means there's no restrictions on that object. Anybody can press it and it'll have its full functionality. An access level of 7 means you have to have a user access level of 7 in order to actually operate that object. And if you're in between, then you have to have a user access level that is at or higher than the level for the object. And if you want to protect an entire screen, you simply assign an access level to the jump object that gets you to that screen in order to keep certain operators from accessing that particular screen. Okay, now at runtime, what happens? Well, an operator would log in, or if they haven't logged in, the access level effectively is going to be at 0 for that particular operator. And then if they attempt to push a button that has an access level higher than their authorized level, they will get an access denied they'll get an access denied pop-up on the screen that will let them know that they don't have sufficient access level to perform that function. The other thing you're going to need to do in terms of Cscape setup is you're going to need to set up user credentials. And that's done from the Cscape's graphics editor. You go to the config menu in the Cscape graphics editor and you'll find user security configuration. And that's where you can plug in up to 255 sets of credentials. Each credential consists of a username, up to 16 characters, a password, up to 10 characters, and you can type them in either as a constant, in other words, a fixed username, fixed password, by typing the data in between single quotes, or you can type in variable names instead, okay, and then those credentials will be pulled from those particular variables. Now, the other thing that you're going to need to configure, well, you don't have to configure, but it can be useful, is that there also is a status register that you can assign that will tell you what operator is logged in at any point and then how long they've been logged in. And you'll see that information for both the local operator as well as WebMI if you've configured the status register to support WebMI as well. The last thing you'll need to do from a setup standpoint is you're going to have to place somewhere in your project on one of the screens, there's going to need to be a login object, a system login object placed on the screen that the operator can then use to log into the system. Now, the way you do that is that you, again, go to the graphics editor, you find the password object, which I've highlighted in the upper right there in red. You place a password object on the screen, and then by going into its dialog, you select user access as the type, and then boom, up pops a system login object that you can then resize to whatever size that you want. So again, you're going to need one of those. So that is a quick review of the user access or user security feature. Now let's talk about some of the new information we're going to share with you today. Now again, in our previous video, we really only talked about, in any kind of detail, hard-coded username and hard-coded password. Today we're going to talk also about variable-based user credentials, not just the hard-coded ones. Now, the advantage to a hard-coded username and password is it's easy to do. It can be done within Cscape. You just type it in between single quotes. Also, it's the only type of credentials that WebMI can support. So if you use hard-coded credentials, then you can use the same credentials for WebMI as you do locally on the touchscreen. Now, that being said, there are some real advantages to variable-based user credentials. From the standpoint of maintaining the machine over the life of the machine, you can go in and change credentials, change usernames and passwords and access levels and those sorts of things over the life of the machine, and you don't have to get Cscape out to make those kind of changes. You can do it right from the touchscreen, and we'll show you how to do that. But one of the limitations might be you have to take a few extra steps to get that scheme working along with WebMI, and we'll cover what's required there later on in the program. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and just show you specifically how you would implement user credentials that are variable-based in your project. So let's go ahead and fire up Cscape. Okay, and again, most of what you're going to do for this feature is going to be done in the graphics editor. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the graphics editor for my project that's already been created. All right, so let's go ahead and first of all, let's take a look at some objects where we have set the access level above the minimum of, say, 0. So for machine setup, that's a fairly obvious one that we would want to protect. We don't want just anybody to go in and make setup adjustments to the machine. This is a jump button that would take us to the machine setup screen. So if I double click on this guy and I see here the access button, I can see that the access level was previously set by me to a level higher than 0, and I set it at a mid level of 4. So any user who wants to access that screen by pressing that button, their access level has to be 4 or higher for that to happen. Okay, I also did something similar with user admin. This is where you would go in and potentially edit username and password type information. That's also set with an access level, this time a little bit higher than, almost up to the maximum level of 7. Now again, the specific levels you set your objects at is completely up to you. You can leave everything at 0 really if you don't want to really implement the feature. But if you're going to fully implement the feature, you really should set at least a couple different levels of access for your project. Now let's go in and take a look at the specific user credentials and the way they're configured for this particular project. Again, in the first video we did, everything was hard coded. You'll see a difference here. So we're in the config menu in the graphics editor. We go to user security configuration. And here you can see I've assigned what looks like about 11 different user credentials, sets of passwords, usernames, and access level. And most of them I've set up as variables. So if we take a look here, let's take a look at this first one here. And what I have is I have a variable assigned for username, a variable assigned for password, and another variable assigned for access level. Now the username style variable I've assigned happens to be one I've created, which is a byte type variable array with a dimension of 16 bytes, or in this case 16 characters, since we're talking about an alphanumeric username. From a password standpoint, again, the same. It is a byte style array variable. This time, I believe the password has a length of 10. I think this might be a typo in Cscape. And then the access level is just a integer type variable because the access level will be between 0 and 7, just a unsigned integer. Okay, and I've effectively got 10 different sets of variables that are all configured with different username credentials that I can change at runtime since they are variables. And then you'll notice I did have one kind of hard coded set of user credentials. And the reason I put these in is so that when a project is first loaded, there'll be at least one hard-coded password that I can use to navigate through the touchscreen at the highest level. So if I need to set some other things up, I can do so from the touchscreen. And you'll notice that these are hard-coded in that the username and password are between single quotes, whereas the access level is just an integer, so it is not. Okay, so that's what I've done here in terms of variable creation for the user credentials. All right, and again, I've gone through on different objects on different screens, and I've assigned a higher than 0 access level. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the bench and see what this looks like at runtime. Okay, so here we go. So here's my home screen, looking at this in runtime. All right, so let's just kind of verify, first of all, that there's no user logged in right now. So we can see from there, from this status register that I'm monitoring, that there is no logged in OCS user, and they have been logged in for no time. Okay, so let's go ahead and log in. Okay, so there's our user login object. I'm going to go ahead and log in as, well, first of all, before I do this, let me show you what happens when I'm not logged in. Okay, so I'm going to go, first of all, let's go to the machine status screen. Okay, now this is a screen that effectively just about anybody can view, even if there's nobody logged in. And viewing it is not a problem. However, if I want to start or stop the process or change the set point, I'm going to be denied because I don't have sufficient security, because the access level of the start process button and the process set point data field are protected. But you'll notice I didn't have to create a completely different screen for people to be able to see this process information. So again, that's kind of the whole idea behind object level protection. Okay, and if I try and go into the user administration screen, again, you can see I don't have sufficient access for that. All right, so now I'm going to log in as the OEM, which is the highest level that I've assigned currently. So let me go ahead and go to the user login. Would help if I remembered the login information, wouldn't it? Okay, so now you can see from looking at the bottom there that the new user is now OEM. And if we go back to our status, we can see, sure enough, the OCS user OEM has been logged in for 10 or 11 seconds now. Now I can show you how you can go in and make modifications to the user credentials because I have the appropriate access level on this user admin screen I've created. Okay, so what we're looking at here is just a regular screen that I created in Cscape that has ASCII data fields on it that are referencing the username variables and the password variables that I have configured or I want to configure for my system. Okay, and you can see that I've created 5 different sets of user credentials on the left there, and then there's another 5 that I haven't touched. But if I want to go in and change any of these, I can do that as well. So if I want to change the password for the operator, I can go ahead and make that change here. Okay, so this is all completely editable at runtime, which makes it really convenient. Okay, so this is really how we would implement variable-based user credentials by setting them up as variables when we do the configuration in Cscape, and then also creating some sort of screen, like the one I'm showing you right now, that gives you the ability to edit those at runtime. All right, so let's go ahead and continue on with more information on user access. Now let's talk about the scenario where we want to have a system in the factory at runtime that operates like the one I just showed you with really on-the-fly changeable usernames and passwords, but we also want to use WebMI. How can we use both of those and not be totally restricted to a hard-coded username and password? Well, let's show you how to do that. Well, what you'll be able to do really is this. So normally, with WebMI, let's say that you've created a project for your OCS and you just want to more or less duplicate the screens and be able to remotely access that from WebMI from a web browser. So the way you would normally do that is right in the same project, after you've completed your project in your OCS, right from the same project, you would effectively go in and you would build WebMI screens and download those to the memory card, and then those could be accessible through a web browser. So you'd utilize the same project that you use to create the actual project itself running in the OCS. However, if you are using user access and you want to make variable-based user access running on the touchscreen itself, but you still want to support WebMI, here's how you would do it. So first of all, you can't use the exact same Cscape file that you used in your OCS directly. What you'll need to do is create a copy of that, or one way to do it is to do a save as and save it under a different name, again, after it's all completed and running in the OCS and everything is good. And then once you've created that duplicate copy, you're going to go into hardware configuration and you're going to change the target from whatever OCS is actually running the runtime project to something we call Web Designer. And then you're going to select the resolution of the web pages that you would like to create and show your WebMI information remotely. Now, if all you really want to do is more or less duplicate the screens that you have in the OCS, then you're going to pick a resolution which is of a similar aspect ratio to the one you're already using in your OCS. And I'll show that to you here in a minute. And then finally, what you'll do in the duplicate project that you just created is you'll go in and you'll change your credentials for user access from being variables to being all hard-coded. So yes, you potentially will have a different set of user access, username and password when you're logging in over WebMI than you do when you're logging in locally. But you could set them the same. It's just, again, locally running on the machine, they're going to be stored in variables, and remotely accessed over WebMI, they're going to be hard-coded. All right, so now let's show that process, if you will, of taking your project from what's running in your OCS to what you can run via WebMI. But instead of having variable-based type credentials, you're going to switch those to hard-coded credentials. All right, so let's fire up Cscape. Okay, and this time I'm going to get out of the graphics editor because the first thing I want to do is create a duplicate of my project. So this is the project that's running in the OCS. I'm going to create a duplicate. One way I can do that is with a save as, and I'll go ahead and give it a name such as WebMI only for my project. Okay, or let's just call it WebMI. Okay. All right, so I've got a new project that I've called WebMI. It's a duplicate of my existing project. Okay, first step is I need to go to the hardware configuration, and I need to change my device type, or my series, if you will, from XL OCS series to Web Designer, and then I need to pick my resolution. Now, I've got an XL7, which has a wide aspect ratio. I'm going to pick a wide aspect ratio screen, and in this case, I'm going to pick 1200 by 800 resolution, because that's a similar aspect ratio to what I'm already using. Okay, and now I can go in and take a look at the screens that I'm going to see on WebMI. Now, one thing you'll notice is that all the information is in the upper left-hand corner. So if I want to kind of fill the screen to make it look a little bit better, I can do that manually, or I can do it quasi-automatically by going to Screens and selecting Fill All Screens. And then effectively, it's going to, as you see, it's going to stretch everything out pretty well to cover the entire screen. So as I kind of go through the screens here, you can see it did a pretty good job of, adjusting the screens to full screen. So that was something that was relatively easy to do. Okay, and then the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my config and user security, and I'm going to get rid of all these variable-based credentials, and I'm going to go with strictly hard-coded credentials. Okay, so let me delete each of these users. All right, I'll have to add a feature request to be able to highlight multiple ones simultaneously so I can delete them en masse. I haven't done that. Okay, and now we're left with strictly one hard-coded password. Now, I'm going to want way more than one. I could even put in 200 if I wanted, but let me go ahead and at least add one in here. And I'm going to add one called production. And if it's hard-coded, the username and password needs to be between single quotes. So let's go with this for a password, and let's say it's access level 6. Okay, and then I could add a whole bunch more. Again, these are hard-coded, but you could have a whole bunch of them to choose from that you could assign to specific users logging in remotely. Okay, so now once that's done, now it's just a matter of going into the WebMI menu, and what I like to do is I like to publish to removable media, okay? And then manually copy those files over to my OCS. So I've got a message here that says everything's been completed successfully. Now, if I hadn't changed over my user credentials to fixed, this is where I would have gotten that error message that I had kind of shown you in the slide presentation. So this is where you would run into that problem if you had forgotten to switch to fixed-based credentials. Okay, so let's go ahead, now that we've done that. Let's go ahead now. This is the stage where I would copy that WebMI folder to the root directory of my micro SD card running in the XL7. I did that already earlier, so I'm going to go ahead and just fire up my web browser now. Okay, and I'll navigate to the OCS's IP address. Let me type in my credentials here and sign in. All right, once I accept the license and hit continue, now I've got full support to the objects or to the project on my OCS, and I still locally on the touchscreen have the ability to maintain all those login credentials through variables and change them as many times as I'd like throughout the life of the machine. So that was what I wanted to show you today, adding a little bit of extra information to user access, and that is how do you deal with variable-based user credentials versus strictly the hard-coded ones that we showed you before. Okay, so this is where I remind you that we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, whether we're fully live like today, or whether we are pre-recorded but yet streaming live with someone standing by to answer your questions from the chat section. And when you watch us on replay, you always have the ability to add comments and questions in the comment section, and we get back to those pretty darn quickly. Okay, now next week, we have a fun program for you, a little different than we normally do. It's just going to be a conversation with an automation professional who has seen a bunch of applications, and a bunch of them are really unusual and fun. So we're just going to spend some time with Jim Hausch, one of my favorite people in the world, who's just, again, he's been in the industry just about as long as I have, and he's got a lot of great stories, and we're going to kind of share those with you next week. Okay, for those of you who have not subscribed to our channel yet, don't hesitate to do so. It doesn't cost anything, and if you choose notifications when you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we post a new video. Okay, so until next week, let's all get out there and let's do us some good.